Diane Miller had a theory about her aunt's taste in men, and the theory was that her aunt had none. It wasn't something she'd arrived at quickly. It had taken years. Years of Sunday phone calls that ended with, "I met someone perfect for you." Years of showing up to restaurants with low expectations and somehow leaving with even lower ones. Years of being set up with men who were described as successful or charming or very well put together, and turning out to be none of those things in any meaningful way. There was the friend of a friend, a man named Toby, who had spent their entire dinner explaining in detail why his current company did not appreciate him. Not once, not twice. The man had looped back to it 4 times. 4 times she had nodded and said, "That sounds frustrating," and 4 times he had said, exactly, you get it," and launched back in. She had gone home that night and stared at her ceiling for 20 minutes. There was the son of a woman from her aunt's church, a man who had shown up 40 minutes late, looked at her across the table with a particular kind of blankness and said, "Are you the one with the good job or the other one?" She had smiled so hard her face hurt. She had not ordered dessert. And then there was the one she did not like to think about for too long, the one her aunt had spotted on the train. Spotted. On the train, as in, she had seen a man sitting in the tube, decided he had a good face, and somehow obtained his number to pass along to her niece. The face had, in fact, been good. The rest of him had been a deeply unsettling surprise. By the 3rd date, she had started referring to him in her phone as person of concern. By the 4th, she had blocked him on everything, including LinkedIn. She hadn't even known blocking someone on LinkedIn was something people did until him. So when her Aunt Ngozi called 3 weeks ago and said she had met the most wonderful young man, Diane had said, in the way that meant she was listening while actually already deciding she would give it 1 hour and then develop a headache. The young man's name was Kwon Jun Seo. He was Korean, her aunt had said, as though this were a selling point separate from his character, which Diane had found both unnecessary and a little funny. She had asked what he was like as a person, and her aunt had said very responsible, which, after the church son and the person of concern, she supposed was technically progress. She had confirmed the restaurant. She had confirmed the time. She had put on a dress that said she was making an effort without saying she was making too much of one, because she had learned that lesson the hard way when she had shown up in full silk for the Toby dinner and spent 3 hours hearing about corporate ingratitude. The dress was nice. The expectations were low. She was prepared. What she was not prepared for was the text that came in at 6:47, 13 minutes before she was supposed to meet Kwon Jun Seo at the restaurant. "Hey, really sorry. Got held up at work. Not sure I'm going to make it tonight." Diane read it once, read it again. Then she put her phone in her bag, looked out the window of the cab she was already in, and felt something she was slightly embarrassed to identify as relief. She was going to go anyway. She had already paid for this cab. The restaurant was supposed to be good, and she had not eaten since noon, and she was not going to let a canceled blind date take a nice dinner from her. She would sit down, she would order something expensive, she would enjoy her own company for once without having to hear about anyone's workplace grievances, and she would go home. That was the plan. The restaurant was warm in the way that good London restaurants are warm, which is to say softly lit and just loud enough that you felt like you were inside something rather than just sitting in a room. Diane gave her name at the front, was led to a table for 2 near the window, and settled in with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had just decided to have a pleasant evening entirely on her own terms. She ordered a glass of wine. She looked at the menu. She was genuinely fine. She was halfway through deciding between the sea bass and the lamb when she felt someone stop at her table. She looked up. The man standing there was tall, broad-shouldered in a way that was noticeable without being overwhelming, and wearing a shirt that fit him in a way that suggested he had not bought it off a rack and hoped for the best. He had a good face. Not good the way the person of concern had a good face, which turned out to be the most misleading thing about him. Good in a way that was almost inconvenient to look at directly. Diane blinked. "Hi," the man said. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic was genuinely unreasonable tonight." And just like that, the text made sense. He had been stuck. He had made it anyway. Kwon Jun-seo had looked at his situation and decided a canceled date was not the kind of man he wanted to be. She could respect that. "It's fine," she said, and she meant it more than she'd expected to. "I just got here." He sat down and he smiled at her, and it was the kind of smile that did not come with an agenda behind it. "I'm June," he said. She heard June. She heard the beginning of the name she'd been given. The restaurant was warm and slightly noisy, and her wine had just arrived, and she was already recalibrating every expectation she had walked in with. "Diane," she said. "Nice to meet you, Diane," he said. And then he picked up the menu and said, "Have you tried anything here before? My colleague swears by the lamb." She looked down at her menu. "I was just looking at the lamb, actually." He glanced up. "Yeah?" "Yeah." He set the menu down slightly. "Okay, so that's either a sign or a coincidence, and I haven't decided which yet." She laughed before she could stop herself. It was not a polite laugh. It was a real one. The evening, she thought, had taken a turn. Nesties, if you are already feeling something, go ahead and subscribe because this story is only getting started. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever shown up somewhere fully prepared to have a bad time and been completely wrong? Kang-jun had not wanted to come tonight. That was the honest version of events, and he was generally a person who preferred honest versions of things even when they were unflattering. He had not wanted to come. He had almost canceled twice, and the only reason he was currently sitting across from a woman who was laughing at something he said in a way that made him feel unreasonably pleased with himself was because his mother had called him at 6:15 and said, "Juna, please just go. 1 hour. For me." And he had gone because arguing with his mother about blind dates she had arranged with great personal investment was not something he had the energy for on a Wednesday. His mother's taste was not bad exactly. It was just very specific. She had a type she liked to find for him, which was accomplished, family-oriented, and preferably already thinking about the future. And what this meant in practice was that every woman she had ever introduced him to had been perfectly lovely, and he had felt absolutely nothing. Not because anything was wrong with them, just because there was a version of a date that felt like a job interview you were both trying to be polite about, and he had been on enough of those to recognize one immediately. He had walked into the restaurant tonight ready for exactly that. And then he had spotted her at the table his mother had described, near the window, looking at a menu with the focused expression of someone who was actually going to order something good and not just a salad to seem low maintenance. Something about that had made him relax slightly before he had even reached the table. He had said sorry for being late because he was late. Traffic had been unreasonable, and she had said it was fine in a way that actually meant it was fine, rather than the performative version of fine he had learned to recognize over years of doing this. And then they had both looked at the lamb, and it had been, of all things, a genuinely funny moment. He was not sure what he had been expecting. Not this. "Okay, so I have to ask," Diane said, setting her wine glass down. "Did your mother give you a whole briefing before tonight, or was it just the general outline?" Jun looked at her. "Define briefing. Like, did she tell you what to order? What topics to avoid? Did she give you a vibe check on me beforehand?" He was quiet for exactly 1 second too long. Diane pointed at him. "She did. She gave me context," he said carefully. "Not a briefing. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "A briefing implies military precision. This was more of a gentle suggestion situation." "What were the suggestions?" He picked up his water glass. "I feel like this is a trap." "It's not a trap," she said. "I'm asking because my aunt called me 3 separate times in the week leading up to tonight, and I want to know if this is a universal experience or if it's just her." He put the glass down. 3 times. 3 times. 1 to confirm I was going. 1 to tell me what to wear. 1 to remind me to smile more because apparently I have a resting face that reads as intimidating. Jun looked at her face. He did not find it intimidating. He found it interesting, which was different. "My mother texted me a restaurant review," he said, "so I would know it was a good place and not feel like she was sending me somewhere embarrassing." Diane stared at him. "She texted you a restaurant review?" "She wanted me to know she had done her research." "That's actually very sweet." "It was a long review." How long? She highlighted sections. Diane laughed again, and it was the same as before, unplanned and genuine, and June felt that unreasonable pleasure again, and this time he didn't try to talk himself out of it. The waiter came. They both ordered the lamb without discussing it, which should not have felt like anything, and felt like something anyway. "Okay, so your mother is sweet," Diane said once the waiter had gone. "My aunt is also sweet, but her methods and tastes can be quite chaotic." "How so?" he asked. "So the last person she set me up with before tonight was a man she met on the train." June stopped. "Sorry?" "The train. The tube. She saw him sitting there, decided he had a good face, and got his number. She got a stranger's number on the tube. To give to me." "And you went?" "I went 3 times, Diane said. Because the first 2 times I thought maybe I was being too harsh, and then the 3rd time I added him to my phone as person of concern and blocked him everywhere." "Person of concern," Jun repeated slowly. "Including LinkedIn." "You block someone on LinkedIn. I didn't even know that was possible until him." He was laughing now, properly, and she was watching him with an expression that suggested she was glad the story had landed the way it was supposed to. "Before him," she continued, "there was a man who showed up 40 minutes late and asked if I was the one with the good job or the other one." "The other one?" "Apparently there was another candidate and he hadn't been briefed on which one I was." "That's—" "And before him, there was a man named Toby who spent the entire dinner telling me his company didn't appreciate him. 4 times. Same story. I counted." Jun sat back slightly. 4 times. I said, "That sounds frustrating, 4 times, and each time he said, 'Exactly, you get it,' and then just kept going." "Did you get it?" "I got that I wanted to leave," she said pleasantly. He shook his head slowly, still smiling. "And yet you're still here, still letting your aunt set you up." "She's very convincing," Diane said, "and I love her. And she feels genuinely bad every time one goes wrong, which almost makes it worse because then I feel bad for being annoyed." Jun nodded. "Yeah, that's exactly it. That's the thing, right? They're not doing it to be irritating. They actually think they're helping." "They are helping," Diane said. "Just not always in the ways they think they are." He looked at her for a moment. "What do you mean?" She picked up her wine. "I mean, I've learned more about what I actually want from all the terrible dates than I ever did from just thinking about it in theory." He considered that. "That's a generous way to look at it." "I'm a generous person," she said simply. "Are you?" "Mostly." "What's the exception?" She smiled. "Men who show up 40 minutes late and don't know my name." He raised his glass slightly. "Fair." They were easy with each other in a way that Jun could not fully account for. It wasn't that the conversation was without friction. There were moments where they disagreed, where one of them pushed back and the other held their ground, and those moments were somehow the best parts. She had opinions, and she did not soften them for politeness, and he found that more interesting than he knew how to explain. At one point he said he thought London was better than New York, and she looked at him like he had said something slightly unhinged. "Better how?" she demanded. "More human scale," he said. "New York is impressive, but London is livable." I have heard that exact opinion from every person who has never actually tried to get anywhere in London on a Sunday. The tubes, she said, are a spiritual test, and everyone who says otherwise is lying or they live 2 minutes from a station. I live 2 minutes from a station, he admitted. She pointed at him again. There it is. He laughed. She laughed. The lamb arrived, and it was, in fact, very good. And neither of them mentioned it because they were already 3 conversations deep, and the food was almost beside the point. There was a moment somewhere between the main course and the question of whether they were going to order dessert, where June's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it, and his expression shifted just slightly before he turned it face down on the table. Diane noticed, but didn't ask. He noticed that she noticed and didn't ask, and something about that consideration settled in him quietly. He would think about that later, the fact that she had seen the look on his face and let it be. What he didn't know was that her phone had buzzed too, 20 minutes earlier, another text from Kwon Jun Seo, this one saying he was so sorry. He had tried to make it work, but tonight wasn't going to happen. Could they reschedule? She had felt the notification in her bag and not reached for it because she was mid-sentence, and the person across from her was more interesting than whatever was in her phone. She had not put that together yet either. The evening moved the way good evenings do, which is to say, faster than either of them wanted it to. They had somehow ended up on the topic of people who made every conversation about themselves, and neither of them had been polite about it. It had started innocently enough. Diane had been telling him about a work event she had attended recently, a brand launch, very sleek, very overproduced, open bar, the kind of thing that should have been fun and wasn't, because she had spent the majority of it talking to a woman who had responded to everything Diane said with a version of, "That reminds me of when I," and then proceeded to not come back. Every single topic, Diane said. I mentioned the canapes, and she told me about a trip to Portugal. I mentioned my commute, and she told me about her car. I mentioned that I liked the venue, and she said she had been to a better one and described it for 10 minutes. Jun nodded slowly. She wasn't listening to you. She was just waiting. Waiting for what? For you to stop talking so she could start. Diane pointed at him. Yes, exactly that. There was no conversation happening. It was just two separate monologues, and only one of them was being delivered out loud. I know that person, Jun said. I know several of that person. There's a version of them at every work dinner I've ever been to. You say something, and they say, yeah, totally, while you're still speaking, and then immediately redirect. Exactly, yeah, Diane said. Before you've even finished the sentence, they've already gone. The worst part is they think they're great conversationalists because they always have something to say. They always have something to say about themselves, he said, which is different. Very different. It's not a conversation at that point. It's an audience situation. She laughed. An audience situation. You're not a person to them. You're a prompt. He shook his head. And the thing is, you can't even be properly annoyed because they're not doing it on purpose. They genuinely don't notice. Which almost makes it worse, Diane said, because you just have to sit there being a prompt and feeling slightly invisible. Have you ever tried redirecting? Twice, she said. Both times they were back within 30 seconds. It's like a reflex. At that point, it's a skill, he said. An unfortunate one, but a skill. They were quiet for a moment, the comfortable kind, and then Jun said, I went to a gallery opening last month. Friend of a colleague. The colleague's girlfriend spent 45 minutes telling me about her own photography in a way that felt like a TED Talk she had been preparing for years and was finally getting to deliver. Was the work good? I never saw it, he said. We were talking about it the whole time. Or she was. I was just being a prompt. Diane pressed her hand flat on the table. That is the most specific version of that experience I have ever heard. It was a long 45 minutes. Did you escape? I pretended I saw someone I knew across the room. Did you? I did not. She laughed and he laughed, and the evening felt easy again in the way it had been easy all night. It was around that point that Diane noticed the couple 2 tables over. They had been there a while, clearly on a first date, clearly in the early careful stage of it, where both people are still performing slightly better versions of themselves. The woman was lovely, attentive, asking questions. The man was handsome and well-dressed, and had spent the last 10 minutes, as far as Diane could tell, finding ways to mention what he did for a living in sentences that did not require it. She had caught the tail end of one. Something about choosing this restaurant specifically because he had a sense for these things, developed over years of traveling for work, mostly between London and Singapore, the Singapore office being the one he technically ran, but he split his time. Diane looked down at her plate. Jun had gone slightly quiet across from her. She glanced up. He was looking at the middle distance in the careful way of someone who had also just heard something and was deciding not to react to it. She said nothing. He said nothing. Then the man at the other table said, in a voice that carried just slightly too well, that the reason he understood wine was that a mentor of his, very well known in certain circles, had taken him under his wing early in his career when he was still building his portfolio. Jun reached for his water glass with great focus and deliberation. Diane looked at her. Cake. The silence between them lasted 5 seconds and was extremely loud. The chocolate is really good, Jun said to no one in particular. Very good chocolate, Diane agreed. They did not look at each other for another full 10 seconds. When they finally did, it lasted about half a second before they both looked away again, and that was the end of that, officially, because there was nothing more to say and everything had already been said. It was a nothing moment. It also wasn't. It was the kind of small private thing that only exists between two people who have been paying attention to the same things all evening without planning to, and it settled between them quietly like something that belonged there. The dessert menu had come and gone. Diane had ordered the chocolate cake after claiming she didn't want dessert. Jun had flagged the waiter before she finished the sentence, and she had given him a look that was half grateful and half annoyed, and he had found both halves equally funny. "I wasn't going to order it," she said. "You were absolutely going to order it." "I was considering it. Very seriously." "The description was interesting," she said with dignity. "Order it." "I'm going to order it," she said, as though this had been her plan from the beginning. He ordered a coffee. The cake arrived, and when she tried it, her face did something entirely unguarded. "Okay," she said quietly. "Good." "Don't say I told you so." "I wasn't going to." "You were about to." "I was considering it," he said. She pointed her fork at him. He raised both hands. They had been there nearly 2 hours. It did not feel like 2 hours. Jun picked up his coffee and was about to say something when his phone buzzed on the table. He looked at it, and the expression that crossed his face was harder to set aside this time. "Everything okay?" Diane asked. "Yeah, sorry, just someone was supposed to meet me somewhere tonight. Different situation." He turned the phone face down. "It's fine." Diane nodded. She did not push. She also filed that away without fully meaning to, the way you do when something doesn't quite fit, and you're not sure yet why. Her own phone was in her bag, and she was aware of it, the way you're aware of something you're choosing not to look at. She had felt it buzz twice since she'd last checked, and had not reached for it, because the evening had moved somewhere she hadn't planned for, and she wasn't ready to let the outside world back in yet. That was new. Usually on her aunt's setups, she was checking the time by the 40-minute mark. "Can I ask you something?" Jun said. "You can try," she said. "What made you actually come tonight, given everything you described?" She thought about it honestly. "My aunt feels genuinely terrible every time one of these goes wrong. I figured if I came and it was bad, I could tell her I tried, and she'd leave me alone for a few months." Strategic appearance. Completely strategic. "And now?" She looked at him for a moment. "Now I'm glad the lamb was good." He laughed softly. "The lamb." "The lamb," she said, and she was smiling when she said it, and he was smiling back, and the restaurant carried on around them, warm and full and entirely unaware that something small and real was happening at the table by the window. And then, across the room, the door opened. Diane did not notice immediately. She was finishing the last of her cake, and they were back on London Transport, Jun saying she was statistically wrong, Diane saying statistics were not the point, both of them enjoying the shape of the disagreement more than the argument itself. It was Jun who noticed the man first. He noticed because the man was scanning the restaurant like he was looking for a face, moving with purpose, heading in their general direction. The man stopped a few feet from their table. He was looking at Diane. He had the slightly breathless quality of someone who had run to get here. "Diane," the man said, "I'm Kwon Junseo." Diane looked up. "Kwon Junseo," she said. The name landed between them like something dropped from a height. Jun went very still. "Kwon Junseo. Not Kang Jun. Not Jun." The man she had spent 2 hours talking to without ever asking his last name. A different Jun entirely, now standing at their table looking apologetic and confused and completely unaware of what he had just walked into. "I'm so sorry I'm late," Kwon Junseo said. "Work was a complete disaster. I kept trying to get out and—" He looked at Jun across the table, then back at Diane. "I didn't realize you'd brought someone." The silence that followed was 4 seconds long and felt considerably longer. Diane's mouth opened slightly. Jun set his coffee cup down without drinking from it. Somewhere nearby, a table laughed at something. Neither of them registered it. "I didn't," Diane said carefully. "Bring someone." Kwon Junseo looked at Jun again. June looked at Diane. Diane looked at June. And in the space of that look, without a single word, 2 hours of easy, unguarded conversation collapsed into the sudden and terrible clarity of what had actually happened tonight. The first thing Diane felt was not embarrassment. It was a strange, delayed blankness, the kind that arrives before your brain has fully caught up to what your ears just heard. Kwon Jun-seo was still standing there. He had a nice face, she registered distantly. Tidy, apologetic, completely unaware that he had just detonated something. "I'm sorry," Diane said. "Can you just—" She stopped. Started again. "What's your name?" The man blinked. "Kwon Jun-seo. We spoke on the phone last week. Your aunt gave you my number." Diane looked at June. June was looking at the tablecloth with the focused expression of a man doing very rapid mental arithmetic and not enjoying the results. "And you are?" Kwon Jun-seo said, looking at June with the careful politeness of someone trying to read a situation he had clearly walked into the middle of. June looked up. Kang-jun. The name sat in the air. Diane heard it properly for the first time. Kang-jun, not Kwon Jun-seo, not the name her aunt had given her. A completely different person who had walked into this restaurant, seen a woman sitting alone at a table for two, assumed she was his date, and sat down. And she had let him, because she had heard June and her brain had filled in the rest without asking. "Kang-jun," she repeated. "Yes," he said. "Not Kwon Jun-seo." "No." "Who are you here to meet?" A pause. "That's a slightly complicated answer." Kwon Jun-seo looked between them. "I'm sorry, what's happening?" "We," Diane said, gesturing between herself and June with the measured tone of someone keeping a lid on something, "have apparently spent the last 2 hours on each other's blind dates." Kwon Jun-seo stared at her. "You thought he was me. I thought he was you." "And he thought you were—" "His date, yes." Kwon Jun-seo looked at June. "Who set you up?" "My mother," June said. "With who?" June reached into his pocket, looked at his phone briefly, and said a name. Diane did not know the name. Neither, from his expression, did Kwon Jun-seo, which meant June's actual date was somewhere else in London tonight, presumably also waiting, presumably also confused, and that entire situation was a separate problem that none of them had the bandwidth to address right now. "Right," Kwon Jun-seo said slowly. He pulled out the chair next to Diane and looked at it, and then at her. "Should I—" "Please," she said, "because what else did you say?" He sat down. The three of them looked at each other. The restaurant continued around them with total indifference. June's phone buzzed. He looked at it, and something shifted in his face. He typed a reply quickly and put it back down. "Your date?" Diane asked. "She's outside," he said. Diane absorbed that. "Okay." "She's asking which table." "Okay." He looked at her. "I'm going to go get her." "Okay," Diane said for the third time, which was 2 times more than she had intended. Jun stood up. He looked at Diane for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, and then he walked toward the entrance, and she watched him go, and then looked down at her empty dessert plate and the half-finished coffee he had left behind. Kwon Jun-seo cleared his throat gently. Diane turned to look at him. He really did have a nice face. Tidy features, warm eyes, a general air of someone who arrived prepared and tried to do the right thing. Under any normal circumstances, she would have been perfectly happy to spend an hour with him and never see him again. "So," he said carefully, "how was the lamb?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed, a short, surprised sound. "It was really good, actually." He nodded. "I've heard good things about this place." "Your timing could have been better." "I know," he said. "I really am sorry. Work was—" "It's fine," she said. And she meant it. She was not annoyed at Kwon Jun-seo. She was not annoyed at anyone. She was sitting inside a feeling she could not name yet. Something that was adjacent to loss, but wasn't quite that, not yet, and she was managing it by being extremely normal. June came back. He was not alone. The woman with him was pretty, put together, with the look of someone who had also gotten dressed with intention tonight. She was saying something to June as they walked, And he was nodding and responding, and from across the restaurant they looked like two people having a perfectly reasonable interaction. They reached the table. "This is Mia," Jun said. He did not look at Diane when he said it, and then he did, briefly. "Mia, this is Diane, and Kwon Junseo," Junseo supplied. "Right." Jun sat down. Mia sat next to him. The table was now 4 people, and a quantity of unspoken information that could have filled the restaurant twice over. "So," Mia said brightly, looking around the table. Jun explained a little bit on the way in. "This is wild." "It's something," Diane agreed. "You really just sat down and talked for 2 hours without realizing?" "We did," Jun said. Mia looked at him. "How did you not ask her name properly?" "I told her my name. We started talking." "But your last name—" "It didn't come up," Diane said, which was true and also slightly absurd now that she was saying it out loud to a stranger. Mia shook her head slowly, smiling. "That's actually insane." "Thank you," Diane said. Kwon Junseo, to his credit, had recovered well. He had ordered a drink, asked Mia a polite question about how she knew Jun's mother, and was conducting himself with the composure of a man who had arrived late to a situation that was entirely not his fault and was doing his best. Diane liked him for that. She did. He was a good person. She could see it clearly. She just kept noticing, in the way you notice something you're trying not to, that the conversation at the table had changed shape. Not badly. Mia was easy company, funny in a quick way, and Kwon Junseo had relaxed into a warmth that she suspected was closer to his real personality than the formal apology version that had arrived at the table. The 4 of them were getting along fine, but fine was the word, fine was the temperature of it, whereas 2 hours ago the energy had been something else entirely, and she was very aware of the difference. Jun was talking to Mia about something to do with a mutual friend, a trip someone had taken, and his voice was the same voice it had been all evening, same cadence, same dry humor. And Diane was having a separate conversation with Kwon Junseo about where he worked and what part of the city he lived in, and she was present for it, genuinely. She was not being rude. She just happened to catch the tail end of what Jun was saying to Mia. "Honestly, the Singapore office is the one I technically oversee, but I split my time between both, so it depends on the quarter." Diane stopped. She looked at Jun. Jun was already looking at her. He had heard himself say it. She could see it on his face, the half-second of delay, and then the full arrival of what he had just said, and to whom, and in what context. The man at the other table. The Singapore office. "I split my time." Diane pressed her lips together. She immediately knew he said that for her entertainment. Jun looked away first. He picked up his water glass with enormous focus. Kwon Junseo was saying something to her about the area of the city he'd grown up in, and she nodded and said really at the appropriate moment, and kept her eyes on Junseo's face, and did not look at Jun again for a full 30 seconds. When she did, he was still looking at his water glass. His jaw was tight in a very specific way. She looked back at Junseo. "Sorry," she said. "You were saying about Peckham?" "Yeah," Junseo said, and continued. And he was interesting. He actually was. And she was trying to listen. But from the corner of her eye she could see Jun's hand flat on the table, and the slight movement of his thumb against the tablecloth, and she knew without looking directly that he was holding himself together from laughing with roughly the same amount of effort she was. Partners in crime, she thought, and immediately wished she hadn't. Mia laughed at something Junseo said and leaned slightly forward. "Okay, I love that. Jun, did you hear that?" "I heard," Jun said. "Diane, your aunt sounds genuinely unhinged, by the way. In the best possible way." "She really is," Diane said warmly. "Jun's mother sent him a restaurant review," Mia said to the table generally. "She highlighted it," Diane said. Mia stared at her. "You told her about the review already?" A small silence. "We talked for 2 hours," Jun said simply. "Right," Mia said. She looked between them with an expression that was not quite readable, and then picked up her menu and said, "I'm going to get the lamb. I've heard good things." Diane looked at the table. Jun looked at the window. Neither of them said anything. Outside, London moved through the glass, headlights and wet pavement and people going places, and inside the restaurant, The four of them sat together in the warm light, and the evening wound toward its end in the way that evenings do, slower than you want and faster than you're ready for. The night finally came to an end, and the bill came. Kwon Jun-seo paid his share without fuss. Mia split with Jun. Diane reached for her card, and Jun-seo waved it off in the easy, undemonstrative way of someone who had decided to be a gentleman about a night that had not gone the way either of them planned, and she let him because arguing felt like too much energy for where she currently was. They gathered their things. The restaurant was thinning out, the later crowd settling into that slow end-of-evening rhythm, conversations dropping in volume, jackets coming off the backs of chairs. Diane picked up her bag and stood, and the full reality of the night pressed in on her all at once. Not heavily, just present. The way the end of something you weren't expecting to enjoy tends to feel when it arrives. Mia was saying something to Jun-seo about a restaurant she had been to nearby. Had he tried it? She thought he would like it, and Jun-seo was saying he hadn't, but he'd heard the name, and it was perfectly pleasant, the four of them moving toward the door together in the loose way of people who had shared a table and were now politely dissolving back into their separate evenings. Jun held the door. They stepped out onto the street. London at this hour was cold and clear, the kind of night that felt clean after the warmth of inside, and Diane pulled her coat around her and looked down the street for a cab. "Well," Mia said. She looked at Diane with something genuine in her face. This was honestly the most memorable blind date situation I've ever heard of, and I wasn't even the one on it. Diane laughed. "I know. Are you okay getting home?" "I'm fine," Diane said. "I'll grab a cab." Mia nodded and turned to Jun-seo. "It was really lovely to meet you, genuinely. I'm sorry the circumstances were chaotic," Jun-seo offered pleasantly. "Chaotic," Mia agreed. Jun-seo looked at Diane. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and his expression was warm and slightly rueful, and she found that she genuinely liked him, in the uncomplicated way you can like someone you have no particular feeling for. "I really am sorry about tonight," he said. "The work situation was—" "Stop apologizing," she said. "Honestly, it wasn't your fault." "Still," he paused, "can I call you? Properly, I mean. Start over." She looked at him. He was a good man. She could see it clearly, and she appreciated it, and she said, "Yeah, call me." And she meant it in the way of someone who was being honest without being certain, which felt like the right amount of honesty for a night like this. He nodded once, satisfied with that, and then said goodbye to Jun with a handshake nod of two men who had met under strange circumstances and had decided to be adults about it. And then he was walking down the street, and Diane watched him go for a moment before looking back at the remaining two. Mia was typing something on her phone. She glanced up. "My flatmate is having a crisis. I just need to—" She gestured vaguely and stepped a few feet away, phone to her ear, which left Diane and Jun standing outside the restaurant in the cold with nobody to be normal for. She had not planned for this part. She looked at the street. He looked at the street. A cab went past with its light off, and she tracked it without really seeing it. "So," Jun said. "So," she said. A beat. "In my defense," he said, "you also didn't ask my last name." She turned to look at him. "That's your defense?" "It's a contributing factor. You sat down at my table. You let me sit down. I thought you were someone else." "I thought you were someone else." She looked at him for a moment. "This is the most absurd evening I have had in a very long time." "Same," he said. And then, quieter, "I had a good time, though." The words landed simply. No agenda behind them, no performance, just a plain true thing said to the cold night air and also to her. She looked at him properly. The restaurant light was catching the side of his face, and the street was quiet for a moment, and she thought about 2 hours ago when she had walked in here fully prepared to endure one more terrible evening for her aunt's sake, and had sat down and been quietly, completely wrong about how the night would go. "I had a good time, too," she said. Jun nodded slowly. He looked down at the pavement for a second and then back up at her. "Mia and I aren't—" He stopped. "I just want to be clear about that. She's my mother's friend's daughter. Tonight was the first time we'd met. You don't have to explain that." "I know. he said. I wanted to, anyway. She held his gaze for a moment. The cold was settling in properly now, and she could feel it at the back of her neck, and neither of them moved. Kwon Junseo seems like a good person, June said. He does, she agreed. Are you going to see him again? She considered being evasive. Decided against it. He asked. I said yes. June nodded. Something moved through his expression that he didn't try very hard to hide. Good, he said, in a tone that meant several things at once. Mia appeared back at June's elbow, phone lowered, coat pulled tighter. Sorry, minor crisis, now resolved. She looked between them. Ready? 1 second, June said without looking away from Diane. Mia looked between them again with the expression of someone who had just understood something she had suspected for the last 20 minutes. She took a small, tactful step back. I don't have your number, June said to Diane. No, she said. Can I have it? She looked at him. Outside the restaurant that had held the whole strange, perfect evening in the cold London air, with the cab she needed to flag down, and the aunt she was going to have to call tomorrow, and the entire absurd situation that had somehow produced this moment, she looked at Kang Jun and thought about the lamb and the shared joke, and the 2 hours that had felt like something entirely other than what they were supposed to be. Yes, she said. He handed her his phone. She typed her number in and handed it back, and their fingers overlapped for 1 second on the exchange, and neither of them made anything of it out loud. Good night, Diane, he said. Good night, she said. She turned and walked toward the curb and flagged down a cab that was coming slowly up the street, and it pulled over, and she opened the door, and she was just about to get in when her phone buzzed in her bag. She stopped. She stood with one hand on the cab door and the other on her phone and looked at the screen. It was a number she didn't have saved yet. The message said, the lamb really was good, though. She stood there for a moment in the cold, with the cab waiting and the city moving around her, and something warm and unhurried opening up in her chest. She looked back down the street. Jun was already gone. She got in the cab. She did not reply yet. She held the phone in both hands and looked at the message, and outside the window London went past in the dark, lit up and indifferent and full of people going places, and she smiled to herself in the quiet of the back seat in the way of someone who had walked into an evening with nothing and come out the other side with something she didn't have a word for yet, but was in absolutely no hurry to define. Nesties, that's it. That's the whole evening. 1 restaurant, 2 wrong tables, and something neither of them planned for. If this story had you feeling things, subscribe so you never miss one. Share it with someone who needs a good romance in their day, and tell me in the comments. If you were Diane, would you have texted back? Drop it below. I need to know.